Pay rent or get out. My wife's mother yelled at me. I was still in a gown, bleeding stitches open. I said no. Her slap made the nurse scream. I hit the floor of the hospital. The head nurse blocked her from coming back. I filed for eviction and called the bank next. The morphine was still coursing through my veins when she walked in. Not walked, barged. Like she owned the damn place, which, knowing Eloise, she probably thought she did. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and that weird metallic scent that clings to everything in these places, and I was lying there trying to keep my eyes open, trying to process the fact that I had 6 fresh stitches running across my abdomen like some twisted zipper. I wasn't expecting visitors. Hell, I wasn't expecting much of anything except maybe some peace and quiet to heal up. The doctors had been pretty clear about that. Rest, no stress, let the body do its thing. But when has Eloise ever given a damn about what's good for anyone except herself? She didn't knock, didn't even pause at the doorway like a normal human being might when entering a hospital room where someone's laid up and vulnerable. Nope, she just steamrolled right in wearing that fake-ass smile she reserves for public spaces, the one that never quite reaches her cold gray eyes. She was dressed like she was heading to some country club luncheon, pressed slacks, that ugly floral blouse she thinks makes her look sophisticated, and enough perfume to choke a horse. Well, she said, and I could already hear the venom dripping from her voice. Look who finally decided to wake up. I blinked slowly, trying to focus. The pain meds made everything feel like I was swimming through thick honey, but I could sense trouble coming from a mile away. Eloise had that particular energy about her, the kind that makes dogs whimper and babies cry for no apparent reason. Where's Tessa? I managed to croak out. My throat felt like sandpaper. Where's Nora? She waved her hand dismissively, like my daughter and wife were just minor inconveniences in whatever twisted agenda she'd brought with her. They're busy. Unlike some people, they have responsibilities. That stung, but I was too tired to bite back. Besides, arguing with Eloise was like trying to teach calculus to a brick wall, pointless and guaranteed to give you a headache. She pulled the visitor's chair closer to my bed, the metal legs scraping against the linoleum floor with this awful screech that made my teeth ache. Then she sat down and folded her hands in her lap like she was about to deliver a sermon or something equally unpleasant. We need to talk, she said, and those 4 words hit me like a freight train. Nothing good ever followed that phrase, especially not from Eloise. I tried to sit up a little straighter, but the movement sent a sharp spike of pain through my midsection. The stitches pulled tight, and I had to bite down on my lip to keep from crying out. Can this wait? I just got out of surgery and… No, it cannot wait. Her voice got that sharp edge to it, like a knife being dragged across glass. You've been freeloading long enough, Malik. Playing house in my home while contributing nothing. Freeloading. The word hit me like a slap across the face, which was ironic considering what was about to happen next. I'd been paying for groceries, utilities, even that damn Wi-Fi upgrade, so her precious Bryce could game all night without lag. I'd been the one getting up with Nora when she had nightmares, making her breakfast, driving her to school, while Tessa worked late and Eloise played queen bee of the neighborhood. I've been paying my share, I said quietly, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they wouldn't matter. Eloise had already made up her mind about something, and once that woman set her sights on a target, she was relentless. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. Just this cold, bitter sound that made my skin crawl. Your share? Your share of what? You think covering a few groceries here and there makes up for the fact that you're a grown man living in someone else's house? The heart monitor next to my bed started beeping faster. I could feel my blood pressure rising, which probably wasn't great given my current condition, but I couldn't help it. This woman had a talent for pushing every single button I had. It's temporary, I said, hating how weak my voice sounded. Just until I get back on my feet. You know the hospital cut my hours. Oh, spare me the sob story. She leaned forward, and I caught a whiff of that cloying perfume mixed with something else, something sour and vindictive. Everyone's got problems, Malik. The difference is, most people don't expect others to solve them. My hands clenched into fists under the thin hospital blanket. What do you want, Eloise? She smiled then, and it was one of the most terrifying things I'd ever seen, like a shark that had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Pay rent or get out. The words hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. Rent. She wanted me to pay rent on top of everything else I'd already been covering. As if I was some random stranger off the street instead of her daughter's husband, her granddaughter's father. No, I whispered, and it came out barely audible. I could hardly breathe, let alone argue. The stitches felt like they were on fire, and every shallow breath sent another wave of pain through my body. That's when she did it. Her hand came out of nowhere, connecting with my cheek with a sound like a gunshot. The force of it knocked me sideways, and before I knew what was happening, I was tumbling off the narrow hospital bed, hitting the cold linoleum floor with a thud that jarred every bone in my body. The impact tore something loose. I could feel wetness spreading across my hospital gown, blood seeping through the bandages where my stitches had reopened. The metallic taste filled my mouth, and for a second, I thought I might pass out. That's when the screaming started. Oh my God! Security! Security! The nurse, a young woman with kind eyes who'd been checking on me every hour, came running. She took one look at me bleeding on the floor and Eloise standing over me like some avenging angel, and all hell broke loose. More nurses appeared. Then the head nurse, a no-nonsense woman named Patricia who looked like she could bench press a small car. She took one look at the situation and pointed directly at Eloise. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now. He's my son-in-law," Eloise protested, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I have every right to." "You have the right to remain silent," Patricia shot back, helping me back onto the bed while another nurse called for a doctor to check my stitches. "You just assaulted a patient in my hospital. Security is on their way, and you're banned from this facility effective immediately." As they escorted Eloise out, still protesting her innocence, still playing the victim, I lay there staring at the ceiling tiles and realized something had fundamentally changed. Not just the physical pain or the reopened wounds, but something deeper. I was done being silent, done taking her abuse, her manipulation, her constant attempts to make me feel like I was less than nothing. That slap had broken more than just my skin. It had shattered the last of my willingness to keep the peace at any cost. As the medical team worked to clean and restitch my wounds, I made myself a promise. This was the last time Eloise would hurt me. The last time anyone would hurt me. It was time to fight back. 3 months before that slap changed everything, I was sitting in my supervisor's office at St. Mary's Hospital, watching my world crumble in real time. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps, and Janet, my boss for the past 4 years, couldn't even look me in the eye as she delivered the news that would send my life spiraling into chaos. "Budget cuts," she said, sliding a manila folder across her desk like it contained my death sentence. Which, in a way, it did. The district's hemorrhaging money, and we've got to make some tough decisions. I stared at that folder, knowing what was inside before I even opened it. Pink slip. Not fired. Exactly. They were too smart for that. Instead, they were cutting my hours from full-time to part-time. 20 hours a week if I was lucky, 15 if the census was low. In a job where I'd been pulling overtime just to keep our heads above water, this was basically a death blow. "Janet, come on," I said, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. "I've been here 4 years. My performance reviews are solid. I've never called in sick, never missed a shift." She held up her hand, and I could see the guilt written all over her face. "It's not about performance, Malik. You know that. It's purely financial. Last hired, first to get cut. That's just how it works." Last hired. Right. Because I'd spent 2 years working at that crappy urgent care clinic before finally landing this gig at the hospital. 2 years of dealing with drug seekers and weekend warriors while watching other nurses with better connections slide into the good positions. When I finally got my foot in the door at St. Mary's, I thought I'd made it. Thought I was set. Shows how much I knew. I walked out of that office feeling like I'd been sucker punched. 20 hours a week wouldn't even cover our rent, let alone everything else. The car payment, groceries, utilities, Nora's school supplies. The list went on, and every item on it felt like another weight pressing down on my chest. The drive home was a blur of stop signs and traffic lights, my mind racing through possibilities that all led to the same dead end. I could pick up shifts at other hospitals, but the nursing shortage everyone talked about was bullshit when it came to actually finding decent work. Most places were offering per diem positions with no benefits and scheduling that changed week to week. I could try the urgent care route again, but those places paid peanuts and treated nurses like glorified medical assistants. When I pulled into our driveway, the driveway of the little two-bedroom house we'd been renting for 3 years, I just sat there for a minute, trying to figure out how to tell Tessa that everything we'd worked for was about to slip through our fingers. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, helping Nora with her homework at the dining table. My daughter looked up and smiled that gap-toothed grin that never failed to make my day a little brighter, even when everything else was falling apart. "Daddy, look, I got an A on my math test." I forced a smile and ruffled her curly hair. "That's my girl. I'm proud of you, baby." Tessa caught my eye over Nora's head, and I could tell she knew something was wrong. She'd always been good at reading my moods, even when I tried to hide them. We'd been together since nursing school, she as a respiratory therapist, me working toward my RN, and after 8 years of marriage, she could spot my poker face from a mile away. "Nora, why don't you go work on that art project in your room?" Tessa said gently. "Dad and I need to talk about grown-up stuff." Once our daughter was out of earshot, the words came tumbling out. The budget cuts, the hour reduction, the impossible math of trying to survive on half my previous income. Tessa listened without interrupting, her face getting paler with each detail. "How bad is it?" she asked when I finished. I pulled out my phone and showed her the calculator app where I'd been running numbers during my lunch break. "If I can pick up some per diem shifts, maybe we can cover the basics. But Nora's inhaler prescription alone costs $200 a month, and that's with insurance." That's when it hit me, the inhaler. Nora's asthma had been getting worse lately, and her pediatrician had mentioned a new treatment that might help. Something about a specialized nebulizer and medication that could reduce her attacks significantly. But it was expensive, really expensive. The kind of expensive that made insurance companies drag their feet and demand prior authorizations that could take weeks. "She had another attack at school yesterday," Tessa said quietly. "Mrs. Peterson called. Said it took 20 minutes for the rescue inhaler to work." My heart sank. 20 minutes of my 6-year-old daughter struggling to breathe while I was at work, completely helpless to do anything about it. The guilt was overwhelming, made worse by the knowledge that I might not be able to afford the treatment that could prevent future attacks. That night, after Nora was asleep and Tessa and I had exhausted every possible solution we could think of, I found myself staring at the ceiling and facing the one option I'd been avoiding. The option that made my stomach turn and my pride shrivel up like a raisin in the sun. "What if we asked your mom?" I said into the darkness. Tessa was quiet for so long I thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she sighed, and I could hear years of complicated family dynamics in that one sound. "She's got that big house," she said finally. "And with Dad gone, she's been rattling around in there by herself." Eloise's house. The 4-bedroom colonial in the suburbs where Tessa had grown up, where family dinners still happened every Sunday, whether you wanted to be there or not. It was beautiful. I'd give her that. Perfectly manicured lawn, granite countertops, hardwood floors that probably cost more than my annual salary. But it was also Eloise's domain, her kingdom where she ruled with an iron fist wrapped in a velvet glove. "Just temporarily," I said, trying to convince myself as much as Tessa, "until I can find something full-time again. Maybe a few months." "She'll say yes," Tessa said, but there was something in her voice that should have been a warning. "Mom always says family comes first." 2 days later, we were sitting in Eloise's living room, the formal one with the white furniture that nobody was supposed to actually use, while she listened to our situation with the kind of expression you might wear while watching a mildly entertaining television show. "Of course you can stay here," she said when we finished explaining. "Family takes care of family. That's what we do." She made it sound so simple, so generous, like she was just happy to help out in our time of need. But even then, sitting there in that pristine room with its carefully arranged throw pillows and strategically placed family photos, I should have known there would be strings attached. There always were with Eloise. "It'll just be temporary," I said again, because apparently I needed to hear myself say it. She smiled that perfect hostess smile. "Of course, dear. Just until you get back on your feet." Famous last words. The guest room smelled like disappointment and broken promises. Not literally, of course. Eloise was too much of a perfectionist to let any room in her house actually stink. But there was something in the air, something that clung to the floral wallpaper and the overstuffed furniture like invisible mold. Maybe it was the way the morning light barely filtered through those heavy burgundy curtains, or how the carpet felt damp under my bare feet no matter how many times I checked for leaks. Whatever it was, it made me feel like I was slowly suffocating, one polite smile at a time. "Good morning, Malik," Eloise would say every single day at exactly 7:30, her voice floating up the stairs like poison gas. She had this routine down to a science. Coffee brewing, morning news playing at just the right volume, everything perfectly orchestrated to remind me that this was her house, her schedule, her rules. I drag myself downstairs, usually already dressed because God forbid I show up in pajamas like some kind of slob, and there she'd be, standing in her pristine kitchen with that fake-ass smile plastered across her face, ready to deliver whatever passive-aggressive bullshit she'd dreamed up during the night. "Sleep well?" she'd ask, but the way she said it made it clear she didn't actually give a damn about my sleep quality. It was more like a daily wellness check to make sure I was still adequately miserable. The comments started small. Little observations that could possibly be interpreted as innocent if you really stretched your imagination. "Oh, you're up early again. Trouble sleeping? I suppose it's hard to relax when you're between opportunities." Or my personal favorite, "I hope Nora wasn't too loud last night." Children can be so disruptive when they're not used to living in a proper home. A proper home, like the place Tessa and I had been renting for 3 years, was some kind of cardboard box under a bridge. Sure, it wasn't a 4-bedroom colonial with granite countertops and a 3-car garage, but it was ours. Had been ours. Until the budget cuts and the impossible math of survival forced us into this nightmare scenario. The worst part wasn't even the comments about me, though those stung like hell. It was watching her undermine my parenting right in front of my face, with Nora standing right there taking it all in like a little sponge. "Daddy, can I have juice with breakfast?" Nora would ask, and before I could even open my mouth, Eloise would swoop in with her expert opinion. "Orange juice has too much sugar, sweetie. Your daddy should know that, being a nurse and all. We'll have water with a lemon slice, much healthier." Or when Nora wanted to watch cartoons after dinner. Television during the week. Oh my, I suppose different families have different standards. Different standards. Jesus Christ. Like letting a 6-year-old watch Paw Patrol was somehow going to corrupt her moral fiber. But what was I supposed to do? Start a fight in front of my daughter? Create tension that would make an already uncomfortable situation even worse. So I kept my mouth shut, smiled and nodded, and tried to be the grateful house guest who didn't rock the boat. Even when every fiber of my being wanted to tell Eloise exactly where she could shove her helpful observations. Tessa was no help. If anything, she seemed to disappear more and more as the days went on. Longer hours at work, evenings out with friends I'd never heard of, weekend shopping trips that somehow never included me or Nora. When I tried to bring it up, she'd get defensive. "I'm dealing with this too, you know," she'd say. "It's not easy for me, living here again. I need some space to process." Space to process. Right. Meanwhile, I was the one getting up with Nora every morning, making her breakfast while Eloise watched and critiqued my parenting choices. I was the one helping with homework, giving baths, reading bedtime stories while Tessa was out processing with her girlfriends at whatever trendy bar had caught her attention that week. Then Bryce moved in, and everything got 10 times worse. Tessa's little brother was 28 years old and had the emotional maturity of a particularly spoiled 15-year-old. He rolled out of bed around noon most days, shuffled downstairs in boxers and a gaming headset, and proceeded to treat the house like his personal entertainment center. The guy hadn't held a steady job in over 2 years, but according to Eloise, he was figuring things out and finding his path. His path, apparently, involved using up all the hot water, eating groceries I'd paid for, and monopolizing the Wi-Fi with his marathon gaming sessions. The first time I found him raiding the pantry at 2 in the morning. "Hey, Bryce, could you maybe check with me before finishing off the kid stuff?" Nora's pretty particular about her breakfast routine. He looked at me like I'd just asked him to solve calculus in his head. "Dude, it's just cereal. Mom will buy more." Mom. Right. Because Eloise was buying groceries with my money, using the cash I handed over every week to contribute to household expenses. But somehow, in Bryce's mind, that made her the provider and me the freeloader. The gaming was its own special kind of hell. This kid, and I'm calling him a kid because that's exactly how he acted, would park himself in the living room with his Xbox and proceed to shout obscenities at strangers on the internet until 3 in the morning. When I asked if he could maybe use headphones after 10 o'clock, when my daughter was trying to sleep, he acted like I was being unreasonable. Come on, man. I can't hear the game properly with headphones. Besides, kids sleep through anything. Kids sleep through anything. Tell that to Nora, who started having trouble falling asleep because some 28-year-old man-child couldn't be bothered to show basic consideration for a 6-year-old's bedtime routine. But the real kicker was Eloise's reaction to all of this. Every complaint I had about Bryce's behavior was met with the same response. He's going through a difficult time. We all need to be patient while he figures things out. Patient. I was supposed to be patient while this grown man ate my groceries, used my Netflix account, and burned through the data plan I was paying for with his constant streaming and gaming. I was supposed to be understanding when he left dirty dishes in the sink for days, or when he used up all the gas in my car and didn't bother to fill it up. It's just temporary, Eloise would say whenever I brought up any of these issues. He'll find his footing soon. Temporary. That word was starting to feel like a cruel joke. Everything about our situation was supposed to be temporary. Our stay in the house, my reduced work hours, the constant walking on eggshells to avoid upsetting the delicate balance of Eloise's perfectly ordered world. But 3 weeks turned into a month. A month turned into 2. And somewhere along the way, I started to realize that temporary might be the biggest lie I'd ever been told. The worst part was watching how it affected Nora. My bright, happy little girl started getting quieter, more withdrawn. She'd look at me with these big, confused eyes, like she couldn't understand why Daddy was letting Grandma and Uncle Bryce treat him like garbage. One night, after a particularly brutal day of passive-aggressive comments and not-so-subtle hints about my situation, Nora climbed into my lap while I was sitting in that damn guest room. "Daddy," she whispered, "are we ever going home?" I held her close and tried to come up with an answer that wouldn't break both our hearts. But the truth was, I didn't know anymore. Home felt like something that existed in another lifetime, back when I had a full-time job and the luxury of making decisions without checking with Queen Eloise first. "Soon, baby," I lied. "We'll go home soon." The ledger showed up on a Tuesday morning, sitting right there on the kitchen counter like some kind of accounting nightmare made manifest. I'd come downstairs early, hoping to grab a cup of coffee and maybe enjoy 5 minutes of peace before the daily circus began. But instead I found myself staring at this spiral-bound notebook with household expenses written across the cover in Eloise's perfect cursive handwriting. My stomach dropped before I even opened the damn thing. Inside were columns. Neat, methodical columns tracking every single expense in the house, broken down by category and person. Groceries, who bought what, when, and how much it cost. Utilities, monthly bills with percentages assigned to each resident. Even stuff like toilet paper and dish soap had been itemized and allocated. It was like a forensic audit of our daily existence, presented with the kind of cold precision that would make an IRS agent weep with joy. "Good morning, Malik," Eloise said, appearing in the doorway like she'd been waiting for me to discover her little project. "I see you found our new organizational system." Our system. Right. Because I definitely asked for a detailed breakdown of who used more than their fair share of laundry detergent last month. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would make me want to punch something. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made, which probably counted as another mark against me in her twisted accounting system, and settled into her chair at the head of the table like she was about to deliver a corporate presentation. "It's called being responsible," she said with that patronizing tone that made my teeth ache. "When multiple families share a living space, it's important to track expenses fairly. This way, everyone pays their appropriate share." Appropriate share. I flipped through the pages, watching weeks of grocery receipts and utility bills blur past my eyes. Every single purchase had been dissected and assigned a value based on who benefited from it. The gallon of milk Nora drank? 50% mine, even though Bryce had been putting it on his cereal every morning. The Wi-Fi upgrade that I'd specifically paid for so everyone could stream without buffering issues? Somehow that had been divided 4 ways, meaning I was getting charged for Bryce's benefit again. But the real kicker came on page 12, where I found a detailed breakdown of additional household expenses that had apparently been incurred because of our presence. extra electricity from Nora's nightlight, increased water usage from our laundry. Even the cost of the guest room towels had been itemized and assigned to my account. "You've got to be kidding me," I muttered, but Eloise just smiled that serpent smile and sipped her coffee like she'd just solved world hunger. "I think you'll find it's all very fair and reasonable," she said. "Family helps family, but that doesn't mean family gets a free ride." A free ride. This from the woman whose unemployed son had been eating groceries I paid for and using utilities I was covering while contributing absolutely nothing to the household except attitude and dirty dishes. The worst part wasn't even the money, though watching my already stretched finances get picked apart line by line was its own special kind of torture. The worst part was the message behind it all. We weren't family anymore. We weren't even guests. We were tenants in Eloise's twisted little empire, and this ledger was her way of making sure we never forgot our place. The expenses kept coming. The Wi-Fi upgrade I'd already paid for. Apparently that was just the installation fee. Now there was a monthly enhancement charge because of increased usage. The groceries I bought every week, those covered the basics. But if Nora wanted her favorite yogurt or if I needed something specific for a recipe, that was an additional household expense that required separate reimbursement. When Bryce's car insurance payment bounced and Eloise asked me to cover it just this once, I should have said no. Should have drawn a line in the sand and told her that her precious baby boy's financial problems weren't my responsibility. But Nora was sitting right there doing her homework, and I didn't want to start a fight that would upset her even more than our whole situation already had. So I paid it. $347 that I couldn't afford, transferred from my already overdrawn account to cover the insurance on a car that Bryce used to drive to his buddy's house for more gaming sessions. "You're a lifesaver," Eloise said, but there was no gratitude in her voice. Just the cool satisfaction of someone who'd gotten exactly what they wanted. "I'm sure Bryce will pay you back once he gets back on his feet." Bryce never paid me back. Surprise, surprise. The stress was eating me alive from the inside out. I'd wake up in the middle of the night with my heart racing, running through mental calculations of what I owed versus what I could actually afford. During my shifts at the hospital, I'd catch myself staring off into space, trying to figure out how I was going to cover the next round of household expenses that would inevitably appear in that damn ledger. My blood pressure was through the roof. The charge nurse mentioned it during my employee health screening, suggesting I might want to talk to my doctor about stress management techniques. Stress management, like meditation and deep breathing exercises, were going to solve the problem of living under the thumb of a woman who seemed to take genuine pleasure in my misery. That's when the whole thing with Bryce's dog happened. I was coming home from a particularly brutal shift, 12 hours of back-to-back emergencies that had left me feeling like I'd been run over by a freight train, when I heard the commotion in the front yard. Shouting, barking, and underneath it all, the kind of panicked screaming that makes your blood run cold. The delivery guy couldn't have been more than 19 years old, probably working his way through college with one of those gig economy jobs that paid peanuts and offered zero protection. He was backed up against the fence, his uniform torn and bloody, while Bryce's pit bull, a muscle-bound monster named Tank who had exactly zero training and even less supervision, lunged at him over and over again. Bryce was nowhere to be found, naturally, probably upstairs with his headphones on, completely oblivious to the fact that his sweet baby was about to maul an innocent kid who was just trying to deliver a package. I didn't think. I just reacted. Jumped the fence and threw myself between the dog and the delivery guy, using my body as a shield while I tried to grab Tank's collar. The dog wasn't having it. He spun around and caught me right in the stomach, his teeth tearing through my shirt and into the soft tissue below my ribs. The pain was immediate and excruciating. I could feel something tear, something important, but I couldn't let go. If I let go, that kid was going to get hurt a lot worse than I was. So I held on, absorbing bite after bite while yelling for someone, anyone, to come help. By the time Bryce finally appeared, still wearing his gaming headset, for crying out loud, I was on the ground bleeding through my shirt. The delivery guy was safe, but I could feel my strength draining away with every heartbeat. "Oh shit, man," Bryce said, like he'd just spilled soda on the carpet instead of watching his dog nearly kill two people. "Tank's never done anything like this before. He's usually so chill." "Chill, right. That's exactly what I'd call a 100-pound pit bull with anger management issues. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and pain medication. 6 stitches to close the worst of the tears, plus antibiotics to prevent infection from the bite wounds. The ER doctor kept asking if I wanted to file a police report, but what was I supposed to say? That my brother-in-law's dog attacked me while I was living in his mother's house. That would go over real well. Tessa met me at the hospital, but she seemed more annoyed than concerned. God, Malik, why did you have to get involved? It's just property damage. That's what insurance is for. Just property damage. Like the kid getting mauled wouldn't have been a human being with feelings and a family who loved him. Like doing the right thing was somehow optional when it might inconvenience the precious harmony of Eloise's household. When I got discharged the next morning, I limped back into that house expecting maybe a little sympathy. Maybe an acknowledgement that I'd put myself in harm's way to protect someone else. Maybe even a thank you for preventing what could have been a lawsuit that would have cost the family thousands of dollars. Instead, I found another entry in the ledger. The ambulance bill, the emergency room copay, even the cost of replacing my torn shirt, all of it itemized and added to my running tab like I'd somehow injured myself on purpose just to rack up more expenses. And there, at the bottom of the page in Eloise's neat handwriting, was the final insult. Household disruption fee, $200. I stared at that line until the numbers blurred together. A household disruption fee. For getting attacked by her son's dog while saving someone from serious injury. That's when I knew for sure that the bruises on my body weren't the only damage I'd sustained. Something inside me had broken too, something that might never heal properly. The part of me that believed family was supposed to take care of each other, supposed to show compassion in times of crisis. Eloise had beaten that out of me more effectively than any physical assault could have managed. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure I'd ever get it back. Walking back into that house after 3 days in the hospital felt like entering enemy territory. The stitches pulled tight with every step, and my whole midsection throbbed with a deep, angry pain that the prescription painkillers barely touched. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological gut punch waiting for me in the kitchen. Another invoice. This one printed on Eloise's fancy letterhead, because apparently she'd made herself official stationery for terrorizing family members, and placed prominently on the counter where I couldn't possibly miss it. The numbers swam in front of my tired eyes, but the bottom line was crystal clear. My monthly contribution to the household had just increased by $400. $400. I read through the itemized list twice, then a third time, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood. But no, it was all there in black and white. Increased utilities due to extended occupancy. Additional cleaning supplies necessitated by extra residents. Something called a property maintenance fee that apparently covered the wear and tear our presence was inflicting on her precious hardwood floors. The kicker was the final line item. Administrative costs for household management, $150 monthly. Administrative costs. She was literally charging me a monthly fee for the privilege of being financially abused in her own home. It was like paying someone to punch you in the face, then thanking them for the opportunity. I stood there in that pristine kitchen, listening to the grandfather clock tick away seconds of my life I'd never get back, and something inside me finally snapped. Not the explosive, dramatic kind of snap you see in movies, more like the quiet, decisive click of a lock opening. Or closing, depending on how you looked at it. That's when I started keeping my own records. The folder started small. Just a manila envelope I picked up at the drugstore, along with a pack of receipt paper and a composition notebook like the ones Nora used for school. If Eloise wanted to play accountant, fine. Two could play that game. But my version was going to be a hell of a lot more accurate than her creative interpretation of household economics. Every receipt went into that folder. Every bank transfer, every Venmo payment, every cash transaction that flowed from my increasingly empty pockets into the bottomless pit of Eloise's financial demands. The Wi-Fi upgrade I'd paid for in full, but was somehow still being charged monthly installments for. The groceries that mysteriously became shared household expenses, even when they consisted entirely of foods only Nora and I ate. The insurance payment for Bryce's car that had turned into an indefinite loan with no repayment plan. I started carrying a small digital recorder, one of those tiny things they sell at electronics stores for students and business meetings. Nothing fancy, just something that could capture audio without being obvious about it. Amazing how differently people talked when they didn't know their words were being preserved for posterity. Malik really needs to understand that generosity has its limits, Eloise said during one of her phone conversations with her sister Margaret. I was supposed to be upstairs resting, but the heating vents in that old house carried sound better than she realized. I've been more than patient with his situation, but at some point, a man has to take responsibility for himself. Click. Into the folder it went, along with a detailed note about the date, time, and context. The video recording started almost by accident. I'd been using my phone to document some of the more egregious entries in Eloise's expense ledger, partly for my own records, partly because I could hardly believe what I was seeing and needed visual proof that I wasn't losing my mind. But then I realized that the camera captured a lot more than just numbers on a page. It captured Eloise's facial expressions when she thought nobody was watching. The cold satisfaction when she handed me another bill. The way she would smile just a little too widely whenever Bryce got away with something that would have earned anyone else a lecture about personal responsibility. It captured Bryce himself, lounging in the living room at 2 in the afternoon, gaming headset on, surrounded by the detritus of a lifestyle funded entirely by other people's hard work. Empty pizza boxes, energy drink cans, and the general aura of a grown man who had never faced a real consequence in his entire privileged life. Most importantly, it captured Nora, my beautiful, innocent daughter trying to navigate a household where she was constantly walking on eggshells, never quite sure which version of her grandmother she'd encounter on any given day. The way she'd flinch sometimes when Eloise spoke to her. How she'd look to me for permission before asking for simple things like a snack or permission to watch TV. Why does Grandma get mad when you're nice to me? Nora asked one evening while I was helping her with homework. We were in the guest room. Our room, though calling it that felt like a lie, and she was working on a math worksheet about addition and subtraction. Simple problems with clear answers, unlike everything else in our lives. The question hit me like a physical blow. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I did. Eloise got mad when I was nice to Nora because it reminded everyone in the house, including Eloise herself, that I was actually a good father. That despite her constant implications to the contrary, I was present, engaged, and devoted to my daughter's well-being. And that truth didn't fit the narrative she'd constructed about my character. I don't know, baby. I lied, because how do you explain toxic family dynamics to a 6-year-old? How do you tell your child that her grandmother views kindness as a zero-sum game, where being nice to one person automatically means being cruel to someone else? But I made sure the recorder was running when I answered. Because someday, when this nightmare was over, I wanted evidence of every moment. Every casual cruelty, every financial manipulation, every instance where my daughter had been made to feel uncomfortable in what was supposed to be a safe space. The folder grew thicker by the day. Bank statements showing the steady drain of my savings account. Screenshots of text messages where Eloise would make increasingly unreasonable demands, always phrased as requests, but delivered with the kind of passive-aggressive pressure that made refusal feel impossible. Photos of Bryce's messes that somehow became my responsibility to clean up, because we all need to pit. The last thing I needed was for Eloise to discover my little documentation project and find some way to spin it into another character flaw, another sign that I was ungrateful for her generosity. Then Jules showed up, and everything changed. I hadn't seen my old friend from nursing school in almost 2 years. We'd kept in touch through social media and the occasional text, but life had a way of pulling people in different directions. When she called to say she was in the area and wanted to stop by, I almost told her it wasn't a good time. The last thing I needed was for Eloise to meet one of my friends and find new ammunition for her ongoing campaign to prove I was some kind of loser. But Jules was persistent, and honestly, I was desperate for a friendly face. Someone who knew me before this whole situation had ground my self-esteem into dust. Someone who remembered that I used to be a competent, confident person with opinions and boundaries and the backbone to enforce them. She showed up with a car full of groceries. Just a little something to help out, she said, and a small brass key that she pulled from her purse like it was no big deal. Oh, I almost forgot, she said, holding out the key with a casual smile. I was cleaning out my mom's place after she moved to assisted living, and she found this in her jewelry box. Said your mother gave it to her for safekeeping years ago, back when they used to play bridge together. Something about a house in Elbridge. I stared at that key like it was a religious artifact. Small and ordinary, worn smooth by decades of use, but somehow radiating possibility in a way that made my hands shake as I reached for it. Elbridge, my mother's hometown, about 40 minutes north of here. I had vague memories of visiting there as a kid, but after she died 5 years ago, I'd been so overwhelmed with grief and medical bills and the chaos of early parenthood that I'd barely managed to handle the immediate logistics of her funeral, let alone dig into whatever property she might have owned. But as I held that key in my palm, feeling its weight and warmth, I began to remember fragments of conversations, references to the house that I'd always assumed meant her apartment, mentions of Elbridge that I'd dismissed as nostalgia for her childhood. What if it wasn't nostalgia? What if there was actually something there, something real and tangible in mine? For the first time in months, I felt something that wasn't exhaustion or dread or the constant low-level anxiety that had become my default emotional state. I felt hope. The drive to Elbridge felt like traveling back in time. Every mile I put between myself and Eloise's house of horrors was another weight lifted off my shoulders, and by the time I reached the outskirts of my mother's old hometown, I could actually breathe without feeling like someone was sitting on my chest. The brass key sat heavy in my pocket, warm from my body heat and the constant fidgeting I'd been doing since Jules handed it to me 3 hours earlier. I'd told Eloise I was going to look into some per diem shifts at the regional medical center, which wasn't entirely a lie, since I had called them earlier in the week. What I didn't mention was that my real destination was 247 Maple Street, an address I'd found scrawled in my mother's handwriting on a scrap of paper tucked inside her old address book. Elbridge was one of those small towns that time forgot, where the main drag consisted of a hardware store, a diner that probably hadn't updated its menu since the Carter administration, and a handful of other businesses that somehow managed to stay afloat despite looking like they'd been abandoned by the outside world. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, and a stranger asking questions was bound to attract attention. But 247 Maple Street wasn't on the main drag. It was tucked away in a residential neighborhood where the houses sat on generous lots with mature trees and the kind of front porches that actually got used for something other than package delivery. The GPS led me down a winding street lined with oak trees that had probably been saplings when my mother was young, their branches forming a canopy overhead that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dancing patterns on the pavement. When I pulled up in front of 247, my heart nearly stopped. It wasn't some rundown shack or abandoned property like I'd been half expecting. It was a real house. A beautiful house. 2 stories of white clapboard siding with hunter green shutters, a wraparound porch with hanging baskets that someone had clearly been maintaining, and a yard that looked like it belonged in a magazine about country living. I sat in my car for a full 5 minutes, just staring at this place that was apparently connected to my mother in some way I'd never known about. The brass key felt like it was burning a hole in my pocket, but I couldn't quite bring myself to get out of the car and potentially discover that this was all some kind of mistake. Finally, I forced myself to walk up the front steps. The porch boards creaked under my weight, not in a concerning way, just with the gentle settling sounds that old houses make when they're well-loved and properly maintained. There was a small brass mailbox mounted next to the front door, and when I peered inside, I found exactly what I was hoping for and dreading at the same time. Mail addressed to Estate of Dorothy Dorsey. My mother's name. My mother's house. Holy shit. The key fit perfectly into the front door lock, turning with the smooth precision of hardware that had been kept in good working order. The door opened onto a small foyer with hardwood floors that gleamed in the afternoon light, streaming through lace curtains. Everything smelled like lemon oil and the faint floral scent of the potpourri my mother had always favored. Someone had been taking care of this place. Really taking care of it. The floors were polished, the windows were clean, and there wasn't a speck of dust on any of the furniture. As I wandered through the rooms, a cozy living room with built-in bookshelves, a kitchen with vintage appliances that had been restored to mint condition, a dining room with a table that could easily seat 6 people. I kept expecting to find some explanation for this impossible situation. That explanation was waiting for me in the small home office on the first floor, inside a wooden filing cabinet that opened with the same brass key that had unlocked the front door. The top drawer was organized with the kind of meticulous care that was pure Dorothy Dorsey. Labeled file folders arranged alphabetically, each one containing exactly what its label promised. The deed was in a folder marked Property Documents. One page of legal language that made my hands shake as I read it. The house at 247 Maple Street, Elbridge, New York, including all fixtures and furnishings, was legally and completely mine. Had been mine since the day my mother died 5 years ago, just waiting for me to discover it existed. But it was the letter in the folder marked for Malik that made me sink into the desk chair and sob like I hadn't cried since I was a child. My dearest son, it began in my mother's careful handwriting. If you're reading this, I know things got bad. Probably worse than bad, knowing you and your stubborn pride. You always were too willing to suffer in silence rather than ask for help. Even when you were little, she'd known. Somehow, she'd known that I'd end up in a situation exactly like this one. The letter was dated just 6 months before she died, when I was still working full-time and living in our little rental house with Tessa and baby Nora. Back when everything seemed stable and secure, and I couldn't have imagined needing a secret escape route. But my mother had imagined it, had seen something in my character, or maybe in the people I'd chosen to surround myself with, that made her prepare for this possibility. This house belonged to your grandmother, my mother, the letter continued. She left it to me when she passed, and I've been keeping it ready for the day when you might need it. Mrs. Henderson next door has been looking after it for me. She has a spare key and comes by twice a week to dust and air things out. I've paid her through the end of next year, so don't worry about that. Mrs. Henderson. That explained the immaculate condition of everything. My mother had essentially hired a caretaker to maintain a house I didn't even know existed, paying for it out of her modest retirement savings because she wanted to make sure I had a safety net. The house is yours, Malik. Completely yours. No mortgage, no liens, no strings attached. You don't owe anyone anything for it, and nobody can take it away from you. Especially not her. Her. My mother had written that word with such emphatic force that the pen had nearly torn through the paper. She'd known about Eloise, had seen through the polite facade to the manipulative core underneath, and she'd planned accordingly. I know you'll try to talk yourself out of using this gift. You'll convince yourself that you don't deserve it, or that accepting help makes you weak, or that there must be some catch you haven't discovered yet. Stop it. This is your inheritance, your birthright, your mother's way of making sure you always have a place to call home. I read that line 3 times before it really sank in. A place to call home. Not someone else's house where I was a guest or a tenant or a burden. My house. My home. Mine. The utilities are set up in your name already. I took care of that last month. The property taxes are paid through next year. There's even a small maintenance fund in the savings account at First National Bank. The account information is in the folder marked Financial. Use it to keep the place in good shape. She'd thought of everything. Every detail, every potential obstacle, every way that pride or logistics or simple disbelief might keep me from accepting this incredible gift. My mother had spent the last months of her life preparing a refuge for a crisis she hoped would never come, but was wise enough to plan for anyway. The letter ended with words that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. You are a good man, Malik. A good father and a good person who deserves to be treated with love and respect. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. This house is my way of making sure you remember that, even when the rest of the world seems determined to tear you down. I love you, and I'm proud of you, and I believe in your ability to build something beautiful here. Love always, Mom. I sat in that quiet office, in that beautiful house that was apparently mine, and cried until I had no tears left. For my mother, who had loved me enough to plan for my darkest hour. For Nora, who would finally have a real home again. For myself, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, I could stop being a victim and start being the man my mother had raised me to be. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't storm back into Eloise's house with guns blazing like some action movie hero. Didn't confront anyone or make dramatic announcements about how things were going to change. Instead, I drove home in complete silence, my mother's letter folded carefully in my shirt pocket and a plan forming in my head with the kind of cold precision that would have made a chess grandmaster proud. The first thing I did was nothing. Absolutely nothing that would tip them off to what I'd discovered. I walked through that front door like any other day, nodded politely when Eloise asked about my job hunting trip, and even managed to smile when Bryce complained about the Wi-Fi being slow during his afternoon gaming marathon. But inside, I was a completely different person than the broken-down man who'd left that morning. I had leverage now. Real, honest-to-God leverage. And I was going to use every bit of it. The second thing I did was call Jules. Not from the house. I wasn't taking any chances on being overheard, but from my car parked outside the grocery store where I'd gone to pick up dinner ingredients. When she answered on the second ring, I could hear the concern in her voice before I'd even said hello. Malik? How did it go? Did the key work? It worked, I said, and those two words carried about 5 years' worth of emotion. Jules, I need a favor. Actually, I need several favors, and they're all going to sound completely insane. She listened without interrupting while I explained what I'd found, what I was planning, and what I needed from her. To her credit, she didn't question my sanity or try to talk me out of it. She just said, "What do you need me to do?" Like helping someone execute a strategic escape plan was the most normal thing in the world. The third thing I did was make copies. Lots and lots of copies. Every receipt, every bank statement, every screenshot and recording I'd been collecting went through the copy machine at the local library. I made 3 sets of everything. One for my lawyer, one for my personal files, and one for insurance in case something happened to the others. The librarian probably thought I was some kind of obsessive-compulsive accountant, but I didn't care. Documentation was going to be my weapon of choice, and I wanted enough ammunition to level a small city. Ms. Ramirez was exactly the kind of lawyer my mother would have approved of, sharp as a tack, no-nonsense attitude, and the kind of reputation that made other attorneys think twice before messing with her clients. I'd found her name in my mother's files, along with a note that said, "She handles family law and property disputes. Trust her, trust her." After months of not being able to trust anyone, those 2 words felt like a revelation. "Mr. Dorsey," she said when I sat down in her office with my manila folder full of evidence, "your mother spoke of you often. I'm sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry it's taken this long for you to discover your inheritance." She reviewed everything with the kind of methodical thoroughness that reminded me why lawyers charge what they do. Every receipt, every recording, every piece of evidence I collected got scrutinized and categorized and added to what she called our case file. Because apparently what had been happening to me wasn't just family drama. It was legitimate financial abuse, and in some cases, outright theft. "The hospital incident," she said, pointing to the photos of my reopened stitches and the security footage Jules had somehow managed to obtain. "That's assault. Clear cut, no question about it. And this." She held up Eloise's ledger with its creative accounting and phantom expenses. "This is financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. We have grounds for both civil and criminal action." Civil and criminal action. The words sent a thrill through me that was probably unhealthy, but felt absolutely justified. The eviction papers were filed first. Not against me, against Eloise, Bryce, and yes, even Tessa if she chose to side with them instead of her own family. Because technically, legally, completely legitimately, they were the ones living in someone else's house without permission. The house in Elbridge was mine, free and clear, which meant I had the legal right to decide who lived in it and who didn't. The protection order came next. Ms. Ramirez assured me that the hospital assault, combined with the pattern of financial abuse documented in my records, was more than enough to justify a restraining order. Eloise wouldn't be able to come within 500 feet of me or Nora without facing arrest. "We're also going to file for restitution," she explained. "Every fraudulent charge, every manipulated expense, every dollar they took from you under false pretenses. Your documentation is meticulous. We can account for almost every penny." I thought about Bryce's car insurance payment, the household disruption fee for getting attacked by his dog, the administrative costs for the privilege of being financially abused. All of it was going to come back to bite them where it hurt most, their wallets. But the real masterstroke was the flash drive. A simple piece of technology that cost maybe $10 at the electronics store, but contained enough evidence to end this nightmare once and for all. Audio recordings of Eloise's conversations about my situation. Video footage of Bryce's entitlement and laziness. Screenshots of every financial demand, every passive-aggressive text message, every piece of documentation that proved exactly what kind of people I'd been dealing with. I labeled it freedom because that's exactly what it represented. The testimony was easier than I'd expected. 5 years of nursing had taught me how to stay calm under pressure and present information clearly and objectively. I told my story the same way I'd write a patient chart. Just the facts, no emotional embellishment, letting the evidence speak for itself. Ms. Ramirez recorded everything, then had it transcribed and notarized. Legal documentation that could be used in court if necessary, but more importantly, could be used to make sure everyone understood exactly how serious I was about this whole thing. They'll try to paint you as ungrateful, she warned me. They'll claim they were helping you out of the goodness of their hearts, and you're repaying their kindness with legal action. I thought about that for a moment, then pulled out my phone and showed her the latest text message from Eloise. Another bill, this one for emotional labor and family counseling services related to my disruptive presence in the household. Let them try, I said. The beautiful thing about having actual evidence was that it made lies impossible to maintain. Every sob story Eloise might try to tell about the ungrateful son-in-law would crumble the moment someone looked at the financial records. Every attempt to play the victim would fall apart when confronted with audio recordings of her actual behavior. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was too hot, too emotional, too likely to cloud my judgment. Instead, I felt something much more dangerous, absolute clarity. I knew exactly what I was going to do, exactly how I was going to do it, and exactly what the consequences would be for everyone involved. My only goal now was peace. Peace for Nora, who deserved to grow up without walking on eggshells in her own home. Peace for myself, because I was done being anyone's punching bag. And if that peace came at the cost of Eloise's comfort or Bryce's free ride, or even Tessa's family loyalty, so be it. Some things were worth fighting for, and my daughter's future was definitely one of them. The wheels were in motion now, and there was no stopping them. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to let everyone know that the game had changed, and I was no longer playing by their rules. They sensed something was off before I said a word. Maybe it was the way I stopped flinching when Eloise made her little comments, or how I'd started looking her dead in the eye instead of staring at my shoes like some beaten dog. Whatever it was, they knew the dynamic had shifted, and their response was exactly what I'd expected from people who'd never faced real consequences for their actions. The lies started small. Eloise began making casual mentions to neighbors about her declining health and how stressful it was to have ungrateful family members taking advantage of her generosity. She'd timed these conversations perfectly, always when she knew I was within earshot, always loud enough to make sure I heard every poisonous war. Her voice carrying that theatrical tremor she'd perfected over the years. The doctors say stress is terrible for my condition, but what can you do when family needs help? Her condition, right. The same woman who power walked 3 miles every morning and could outlift most people half her age was suddenly a fragile flower wilting under the burden of my presence. Bryce's contribution to the campaign was even more pathetic. He started telling anyone who'd listen that I was having an affair with Jules, spinning elaborate stories about secret meetings and suspicious phone calls. Never mind that Jules was happily married with 2 kids and had been nothing but a good friend trying to help me through a rough patch. In Bryce's twisted worldview, any woman who showed me basic human kindness must be sleeping with me. Dude's got some side piece. I heard him telling his gaming buddies over his headset one night. That's why he's acting all weird and secretive. Probably planning to dump his wife and daughter for some nurse he works with. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Here was a 28-year-old man who'd never held a job for more than 6 months, accusing me of being irresponsible while I worked my ass off to support my family under increasingly impossible circumstances. But it was Tessa's betrayal that cut the deepest. My own wife, the mother of my child, started nodding along with her family's narrative like she'd been brainwashed by a cult. She'd sit there during dinner while Eloise made snide comments about my priorities and my commitment to family, and she wouldn't say a damn word in my defense. Maybe you should think about what's best for Nora, she said one night when I tried to talk to her about the situation. This constant tension isn't good for her. What's best for Nora? Like teaching our daughter that it was acceptable to be financially and emotionally abused was somehow in her best interest. Like showing her that marriage meant standing by silently while your spouse got torn apart was a lesson worth learning. I said nothing. just smiled and nodded, and let them build their house of cards while I sat on information that would bring the whole thing crashing down. But Marla Henderson, sweet, observant Marla who lived next door and had been watching this whole drama unfold, wasn't content to stay silent. I saved the security footage from the hospital, she told me quietly one morning while we were both getting our mail. The whole thing, from when she walked in until they escorted her out. The hospital security footage. The smoking gun I didn't even know existed. Video evidence of Eloise slapping me while I was still bleeding from surgery, clear as day and impossible to deny. Marla had somehow convinced her nephew who worked in hospital IT to make a copy before it got automatically deleted. That footage went straight onto the flash drive, right next to every other piece of evidence I'd been collecting. The final nail in a coffin I'd been building for months, one careful piece at a time. The sheriff arrived at exactly 10 a.m., just like Ms. Ramirez had promised. I watched from the living room window as his patrol car pulled into the driveway, followed by a second vehicle containing two deputies who looked like they'd handled this type of situation before. Professional, efficient, and completely immune to whatever sob story they were about to hear. Eloise emerged from the kitchen wearing her best pearl necklace and the kind of outfit she usually reserved for church or court appearances. She'd clearly been preparing for this moment, probably practicing her victim routine in the mirror until she had it down to an art form. The performance was about to begin. Bryce slouted down the stairs wearing designer sunglasses indoors like he was some kind of celebrity being harassed by paparazzi instead of a grown man getting evicted from his mommy's house for being a deadbeat. The sunglasses were probably supposed to make him look cool and unbothered, but mostly they just made him look like exactly what he was, a man-child who'd never faced a real consequence in his entire privileged life. Tessa stood in the hallway, silent as a tomb. No pearls, no sunglasses, no costume for this particular drama. Just my wife, looking lost and confused like she couldn't quite figure out how we'd gotten to this point. Like the months of financial abuse and emotional manipulation had just happened by accident, without her knowledge or consent. I stood next to Nora, my hand resting gently on her shoulder. She was dressed in her favorite purple dress, the one with the butterfly pattern that always made her feel brave when she wore it. My little girl was about to watch justice happen, and I wanted her to remember this day as the moment when we stopped letting people hurt us. The sheriff knocked once, then stepped back and waited. When Eloise opened the door, he didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations that could be argued with. He simply pulled out the official paperwork and began reading in the kind of clear, authoritative voice that left no room for misinterpretation. Per court order number 2024, CV 8847. This property located at 247 Maple Street, Elbridge, New York, belongs to Mr. Malik Dorsey. All current occupants not specifically authorized by the property owner are hereby ordered to vacate the premises immediately. Eloise's face went through about 6 different expressions in the space of 3 seconds. Confusion, realization, rage, and finally that calculated victim expression she'd been perfecting for decades. But the sheriff wasn't interested in her performance, and neither were his deputies. "There must be some mistake," she began, her voice already taking on that quavering quality that had worked so well on neighbors and church friends. "This is my home. I've lived here for—" "Ma'am," the sheriff interrupted. "The property deed is clear and uncontested. Mr. Dorsey is the legal owner of this residence." That's when she lost it completely. The mask slipped, and the real Eloise came out to play. "He's kicking me out. After everything I've done for him. I took him in when he had nothing. And this is how he repays me." The neighbors were starting to gather. Mrs. Patterson from across the street, the Johnsons from 2 houses down, even old Mr. Kimmel, who rarely left his front porch. They'd all heard Eloise's version of events over the past few weeks. The poor, suffering matriarch being taken advantage of by her ungrateful son-in-law. Now they were getting a front-row seat to the real story. I stepped forward and handed the sheriff the property deed, the flash drive containing all my evidence, and my mother's letter explaining everything. She assaulted me in a hospital bed while I was recovering from surgery. I said clearly, making sure everyone could hear. This footage shows the entire incident. The sheriff accepted the items with professional neutrality, but I caught him glancing at the crowd of neighbors with the kind of expression that suggested he'd dealt with family situations like this before. He knew a manipulator when he saw one. That's when Nora spoke up. My 6-year-old daughter looked directly at her grandmother. This woman who'd spent months making both of us feel unwelcome in what we'd thought was a safe space, and said the words that cut through all the lies and manipulation like a sword through silk. "You hurt my dad." That's what ruined it. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Bryce stopped fidgeting with his sunglasses. Tessa's face went completely pale, and Eloise, for the first time since I'd known her, seemed to have nothing to say. Because you can argue with adults. You can manipulate them, gaslight them, make them question their own memories and perceptions. But when a child states the simple, unvarnished truth in front of a crowd of witnesses, there's nowhere to hide. Marla Henderson stood beside Jules, both women holding their phones up to record everything. Not in a gossipy, social media way, but in the deliberate manner of people creating evidence. People who understood that sometimes the truth needed to be preserved for posterity. The sheriff finished reading the eviction order and handed Eloise a copy. "You have until 6 p.m. to remove your personal belongings. Any items left after that time will be considered abandoned property." As they filed out, Eloise clutching her pearls like they could somehow protect her from the consequences of her own actions, Bryce muttering under his breath about how this was all bullshit, Tessa following behind them in stunned silence. I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. That silence wasn't emptiness. It was peace. It was the sound of a nightmare finally ending, of a chapter closing so a better one could begin. It was justice, served cold and legally and absolutely final. For the first time in almost a year, I was standing in a house where I belonged. #Chapter 10, we didn't survive, we won. 2 weeks after the eviction, I stood in the kitchen of our Elbridge house. Our house, not someone else's, making pancakes for dinner because Nora had asked for them, and I could finally say yes without checking with anyone else first. The morning light streamed through windows that belonged to us, illuminating a space where we could laugh without worrying about disturbing someone else's peace. The cottage I'd bought with the proceeds from selling my mother's house was perfect for what we needed. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen big enough for cooking experiments, and a living room where Nora could spread out her art projects without anyone complaining about the mess. It wasn't grand or impressive, but it was ours completely. Nora had picked the paint colors herself, soft blue for her room, warm yellow for the kitchen, and a pale green for the living room that reminded me of spring mornings. We'd spent an entire Saturday at the hardware store, her small hand in mine as she deliberated over paint chips like she was choosing the color scheme for a palace. "This one, Daddy," she'd said, holding up a sample called Morning Meadow. "It looks happy." Happy. When was the last time I'd made decisions based on what would make us happy instead of what would avoid conflict or minimize drama? Months, maybe years. But here in our own space, happiness was not only possible. It was the whole point. The therapy sessions were helping more than I'd expected. Dr. Williams had a gentle way of helping me untangle the psychological damage that months of manipulation had caused, showing me how to recognize the difference between actual problems that needed solving and manufactured crises designed to keep me off balance. "Survival isn't peace," she'd said during our 3rd session. "And silence isn't love. Real love doesn't require you to disappear." Those words hit me like a revelation. I'd spent so long trying to keep everyone else comfortable that I'd forgotten I had the right to be comfortable too. The right to take up space, to have opinions, to say no when someone asked for something unreasonable. The legal settlement had been more generous than I'd expected. Every fraudulent charge, every manipulated expense, every dollar they'd extracted from me under false pretenses, it all came back with interest. Not enough to retire on, but enough to give Nora and me a genuine fresh start without the constant anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck. One Sunday morning, as we watered the small flower garden we'd planted together, Nora looked up at me with soil on her cheeks and asked, "Dad, do you think Grandma's mad?" I considered the question seriously, the way her thoughtful nature deserved. "Probably," I said honestly. "But we're safe now, and safe is more important than liked." She nodded solemnly, then went back to carefully watering each tiny seedling. My daughter was learning lessons I wished I'd understood decades earlier. That peace was worth protecting, that love didn't require suffering, and that sometimes the people who claim to care about you are the ones you need protection from most. We didn't just survive what happened to us. We won. We built something better from the ashes of what tried to destroy us. And every morning in our little cottage felt like proof that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well.